The winter wind howled across the Montana wilderness, driving sheets of snow against John Miller's isolated ranch house. The retired Marine Corps veteran huddled deeper into his coat, scanning the tree line with his tactical flashlight. He never expected that on this brutal December night, a desperate family seeking shelter would change not just his life, but expose a dark secret that had been haunting the peaceful Whispering Pines Valley for months. The horse's eyes, reflected in his flashlight beam, told a story of terror that would shake their small mountain community to its core. Whispering Pines Valley wasn't just another Montana ranching community nestled in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. It was the kind of place where neighbors still helped neighbors, where the weekly farmers market doubled as a town hall meeting, and where John Miller had finally found peace after 3 tours in Afghanistan. The 40-acre ranch he'd inherited from his uncle had become his sanctuary, a place where the nightmares of war gradually faded into the rhythm of caring for his small herd of rescue horses. That night had started like any other. John had finished his evening routine, checking the generators and ensuring his horses were safely in the barn as the season's worst storm approached. The Weather Service had issued severe warnings, predicting temperatures would plummet to 30 below zero, with wind chills making it feel even colder. The kind of cold that could kill if you weren't prepared. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. His most sensitive mare, Aurora, started kicking against her stall door, a behavior she hadn't displayed since John had rescued her from an abuse case 2 years ago. Then came the distant neighing, barely audible over the howling wind. John's military training kicked in immediately. Something wasn't right. Grabbing his heavy winter coat and flashlight, John stepped out into the biting cold. The snow was falling, so heavily he could barely see 10 feet ahead, but years of working with horses had attuned his ears to their distress calls. The sound was coming from the direction of the old logging road that bordered his property, a route rarely used since the timber company had shut down operations last spring. John's boots crunched through the fresh snow as he made his way toward the tree line. His breath frosted in the beam of his flashlight, creating ghostly shapes that danced in the darkness. The neighing grew louder, more desperate. As he rounded a thick stand of pine trees, his light caught movement ahead. There, huddled against the brutal wind, stood a small group of horses, a mare, her foal, and what appeared to be a yearling. Their coats were covered in ice, and they were pressing against each other for warmth, but it was their condition that made John's blood run cold. These weren't wild horses that had wandered down from the mountains. Their ribs showed clearly through their winter coats, and there were marks on their flanks that spoke of human cruelty. The mare lifted her head, eyes reflecting the flashlight beam, and John saw something that made his combat-hardened nerves tingle. Around her neck was a leather halter, partially obscured by her matted mane, but what caught his attention was the distinctive brass plate, the kind used by Crystal Creek Stables, the prestigious breeding facility on the other side of the valley. John approached slowly, using the gentle techniques he'd learned during his years of rehabilitating traumatized horses. The mare was clearly exhausted, but something in her stance told him she was protecting more than just her foal. She kept shifting, positioning herself to block his view of something behind the group. "Easy there, girl," John murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm not going to hurt you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handful of grain he'd grabbed from the barn. The mare's nostrils flared, but she didn't move. Years of working with abused horses had taught John to read their body language, and everything about this mare's behavior screamed of recent trauma. The foal, wobbling on legs that seemed too thin for its body, pressed closer to its mother. The yearling, a handsome bay despite its poor condition, watched John with wary eyes. But it was what lay behind them that made John's military instincts surge to full alert. Partially hidden by the horses and nearly covered in snow was a large canvas bag, the kind used to transport expensive riding equipment. But as John's flashlight beam swept over it, he noticed dark stains seeping through the fabric, stains that his years in combat told him could only be blood. The wind chose that moment to gust stronger, carrying with it a sound that made John freeze. A muffled whimper, barely audible, coming from the direction of the bag. Without hesitation, John pulled out his phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. In a community as tight-knit as Whispering Pines Valley, everyone knew that Sheriff Sarah Cooper was more than just law enforcement. She was the backbone of their community's safety. "Cooper here," came the sharp response, clear despite the storm's interference. "Sarah, it's John Miller out at Sunrise Ranch," he said, keeping his voice steady even as adrenaline coursed through his system. "I've got a situation here. 3 horses from Crystal Creek stables in bad shape, and something else. Something that needs your immediate attention." There was a pause on the line, and John could almost hear Sarah processing the implications. Crystal Creek stables had been in the news lately, but not for their usual championship breeding announcements. There had been rumors, whispers about missing horses, about large sums of money changing hands in the dead of night. "Stay where you are," Sarah ordered, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "I'm calling in backup and heading your way. Don't touch anything that could be evidence." John ended the call and turned his attention back to the horses. The mare had relaxed slightly, seeming to sense his intention to help. The foal had begun to shiver violently, its young body ill-equipped to handle the extreme cold. The yearling had moved closer, drawn by the promise of food and shelter. As John waited for help to arrive, he began to piece together the clues before him. Crystal Creek stables had been the pride of Whispering Pines Valley for generations, producing some of the finest quarter horses in the country. But 6 months ago, ownership had changed hands. The new management had brought with them promises of modernization and expansion, but also an air of secrecy that had set the local community on edge. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the storm's fury. Headlights pierced the darkness as Sheriff Cooper's SUV, followed by 2 deputy vehicles, made their way up the logging road. Sarah Cooper emerged from her vehicle, her experienced eyes taking in the scene before her. 20 years on the force had taught her to read situations quickly, and the grim set of her jaw told John she'd reached the same conclusions he had. "Miller," she nodded, her flashlight beam joining his. "Tell me everything." As John explained his discovery, Sarah's deputies began securing the area, setting up powerful portable lights that turned the snowy night into day. The horses huddled closer together, startled by the sudden illumination, but too exhausted to flee. A deputy approached the canvas bag, camera in hand, to document everything before they disturbed what was clearly becoming a crime scene. The whimper came again, louder this time, and Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her weapon. "Everyone stand back," she ordered, her voice cutting through the wind. With careful movements, she approached the bag, her flashlight revealing more details of the dark stains that marked its surface. The horses shifted nervously, but didn't interfere as she reached for the zipper. The discovery inside would shake Whispering Pines Valley to its foundations, setting in motion a chain of events that would expose a criminal enterprise reaching far beyond their peaceful mountain community. But in that moment, as the storm raged around them, John Miller knew only one thing. His decision to investigate that desperate neighing in the darkness had set him on a path from which there was no turning back. Sheriff Sarah Cooper's hands moved with practiced precision as she carefully unzipped the canvas bag, her breath visible in the harsh glare of the portable lights. Inside, wrapped in blood-stained horse blankets, lay a young woman, her riding clothes bearing the Crystal Creek Stables logo. Her face was bruised, but her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Most alarming was the competition medallion, still hanging around her neck, the same medallion Amy Thompson had been wearing when she disappeared from the Winter Classic competition 3 days ago. "Get medical here now," Sarah barked into her radio, her free hand already checking for a pulse. The young rider's skin was dangerously cold, but her heartbeat was steady. The horses, particularly the mare, watched intently as the deputies worked, their breath creating steamy clouds in the freezing air. It was clear now why the mare had been so protective. She and her foal weren't the only victim seeking rescue that night. John Miller's military training took over as he assisted the deputies in setting up an emergency shelter from the howling wind. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the storm as ambulances navigated the treacherous logging road. The local emergency response team had been on high alert due to the weather, but none of them had expected a call like this. Amy Thompson's disappearance had baffled law enforcement across 3 counties. The rising star of the equestrian world had vanished without a trace after placing first in her event, leaving behind only her phone and a half-empty coffee cup in the Crystal Creek Stables private lounge. The resulting investigation had turned up nothing. No ransom demands, no signs of struggle, no suspicious transactions on her accounts. As paramedics worked to stabilize Amy, John turned his attention to the horses. The mare's halter, partially obscured by her matted mane, bore a small engraving that confirmed his suspicions. "Midnight Serenade," he read aloud, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Sarah, this is Crystal Creek's prize-winning broodmare, the one they claimed died in that stable fire last month." Sheriff Cooper's expression hardened as she photographed the halter. The stable fire had been ruled accidental, but something about the investigation had never sat right with her. The insurance claim had been processed with unusual speed, and the new management had been surprisingly uninterested in investigating the cause of the blaze that had supposedly killed over $1 million worth of horses. The yearling, despite its emaciated condition, showed clear signs of its prestigious bloodline. Its coat, though dull from neglect, bore the distinctive markings of Crystal Creek's celebrated stallion, Thunder's Legacy. The foal, barely 3 months old based on its size, stood on spindly legs that trembled from cold and exhaustion. "Miller," Sarah called, her voice cutting through the chaos of the rescue operation. "We need to get these horses somewhere warm and secure. They're evidence now, but more importantly, they need immediate care. Your facility still has that quarantine barn from when you worked with the rescue organization?" John nodded, already running through the logistics in his mind. The quarantine barn, originally built to house abused horses during rehabilitation, was equipped with surveillance cameras and medical supplies. It was also heated, a luxury he'd installed after dealing with too many winter emergencies. As if understanding they were finally safe, the mare took a tentative step toward John, pulling her foal along with her. The yearling followed, drawn by the promise of warmth and food. Their movement revealed more evidence scattered in the snow. Syringes, empty feed bags bearing the Crystal Creek logo, and most disturbing, a ledger partially protected from the elements by a waterproof cover. Sarah quickly documented and collected each item, her experienced eyes noting details that would later prove crucial. The syringes would need to be tested, but their presence alongside the horses and an unconscious riding champion pointed to something far more sinister than a simple kidnapping. The paramedics had finished stabilizing Amy and were preparing to transport her to the regional medical center. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, something fell from the folds of her jacket. A small voice recorder, its red light still blinking. Sarah sealed it in an evidence bag immediately, knowing that whatever Amy had managed to record could be the key to unraveling the mystery. John led the horses toward his quarantine barn, speaking softly to them as they navigated through the storm. Despite their weakness, they followed willingly, seeming to sense that safety lay ahead. The mare stayed particularly close to the stretcher carrying Amy, nickering softly whenever the young rider made a sound. Inside the quarantine barn, the contrast with the brutal weather outside was immediate. Warm air enveloped them as John activated the heating system, and the horses visibly relaxed as they were led into clean, deeply bedded stalls. The veterinarian would arrive soon, but John's years of experience with rescue horses told him what they needed first. Warm water, small amounts of easily digestible feed, and gentle care to begin removing the ice from their coats. As he worked, John's mind raced through the implications of what they discovered. Crystal Creek Stables had been a cornerstone of the community for generations, producing champions and employing dozens of local residents. Its recent sale to Summit Equestrian Group had brought promises of expansion and modernization, but also changes that had set longtime employees on edge. Several had quit, citing concerns about new training methods they refused to discuss. Sheriff Cooper entered the barn, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated with state law enforcement. The discovery of Amy Thompson and the presumed dead horses had transformed a missing person case into something much larger. The FBI would be arriving by morning, but until then, every minute was crucial for collecting and preserving evidence. "The lab team's on their way," Sarah announced, ending her call. "They'll want samples from the horses to compare with the DNA records from the insurance claim. Miller, I need you to document every injury, every sign of neglect. Your experience with abuse cases makes you our best expert witness until the state veterinarian arrives." John nodded, already gathering his medical documentation supplies. He'd testified in animal abuse cases before, his military background and veterinary rehabilitation experience lending weight to his observations. But as he began photographing and noting the horses' conditions, he realized this case would be different. These weren't just victims of neglect. They were evidence of a carefully orchestrated criminal enterprise. The mare's recovery would later reveal a pattern of small injection sites hidden beneath her mane, consistent with performance-enhancing substances. The yearling's blood work would show traces of drugs banned in competitive racing. But it was the foal, born into whatever dark operation they'd uncovered, that would prove to be the most damning evidence of all. Dr. Rebecca Martinez arrived at the quarantine barn just before dawn. her mobile veterinary unit cutting through the diminishing snowfall. The state's leading expert in equine abuse cases had been attending a conference in Missoula when Sheriff Cooper's call came in. One look at the horses told her why she'd been summoned on an emergency basis. These weren't typical neglect cases. Multiple injection sites along the neck and flanks, she noted, her gloved hands carefully parting Midnight Serenade's matted mane. Consistent with long-term steroid use, but there's something else here. The mare stood quietly under her examination, though her eyes remained fixed on the barn entrance, as if waiting for someone to return. John Miller assisted with the examination, his military precision proving valuable as they documented each piece of evidence. The mare's blood samples would need to be processed at a specialized laboratory, but the preliminary testing equipment in Dr. Martinez's mobile unit was already raising red flags. "These hormone levels are off the charts," she muttered, studying the readout. "They've been manipulating her breeding cycle." The yearling's examination revealed an even darker story. Beneath its malnourished exterior lay evidence of accelerated growth patterns typically associated with illegal performance enhancers. Track marks along its jugular suggested regular intravenous treatments, while its joints showed signs of stress that shouldn't be present in a horse so young. They were trying to shortcut the development process, Dr. Martinez explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. Push it to racing age faster than nature intended. The damage to its musculoskeletal system. She trailed off, shaking her head. This is criminal beyond just abuse. They were experimenting with these animals. Outside the barn, the investigation was expanding rapidly. FBI agents had arrived ahead of schedule, their black SUVs forming a perimeter around John's ranch. Special Agent Diana Chen, head of the Bureau's Animal Trafficking Division, strode through the snow toward the quarantine barn, her expression grim as she studied the scene. "Sheriff Cooper," she called out, presenting her credentials. "We've been tracking a series of suspicious insurance claims involving high-value show horses across 3 states. Crystal Creek wasn't on our radar until now." She paused, surveying the activity around the barn. "What you found here might be the key to breaking the whole operation open." Sarah Cooper quickly brought Agent Chen up to speed on their discoveries. The voice recorder found with Amy Thompson had been rushed to the FBI's mobile forensics unit, its contents potentially crucial to understanding the full scope of Crystal Creek's activities. The ledger discovered in the snow was already yielding disturbing information about a network of illegal breeding and racing operations. Inside the barn, the foal's examination had taken an unexpected turn. Dr. Martinez's genetic testing equipment had flagged an anomaly in its preliminary blood work. "This can't be right," she muttered, running the test again. The results remained the same. The foal's DNA markers indicated it was offspring of a stallion that had reportedly died in a trailer accident 2 years ago, long before its conception should have been possible. Frozen semen wouldn't account for these genetic markers, Dr. Martinez explained to the gathering of law enforcement officials. These results suggest the stallion was alive and breeding well after its reported death. The insurance claim paid out over $2 million on that horse alone. Agent Chen's team had set up a mobile command center in John's main barn, transforming the tack room into a hub of investigative activity. Photographs of key Crystal Creek personnel lined one wall, connected by strings that traced patterns of suspicious transactions and mysterious accidents. At the center was Marcus Reynolds, the charismatic CEO of Summit Equestrian Group, who had orchestrated the purchase of Crystal Creek Stables. "Reynolds has been on our watch list," Agent Chen revealed, pointing to a series of satellite photos showing similar facilities across the country. "We believe he's been buying up prestigious stables, using them as fronts for a sophisticated breeding and racing scam." Insurance fraud was just the beginning. The storm had finally begun to ease, revealing a landscape transformed by more than just snow. News vans were arriving at the edge of John's property, drawn by leaked reports of Amy Thompson's discovery. The story of the missing rider and the mysteriously resurrected horses was about to break wide open. Sarah Cooper's phone buzzed with an urgent message from the hospital. Amy Thompson had regained consciousness and was asking specifically to speak with law enforcement. More importantly, she was asking about the horses, particularly Midnight Serenade. The mare's rescue of the young rider, it seemed, was no accident. "She knows something," Sarah told Agent Chen as they prepared to head to the hospital. The way those horses were positioned around her, the voice recorder. This wasn't a random discovery. Amy Thompson was trying to expose something, and it nearly got her killed. John Miller watched from the quarantine barn as the law enforcement convoy departed. His years in combat had taught him to recognize the calm before a storm, and every instinct told him this investigation was about to uncover something that would shake the equestrian world to its core. The mare nickered softly, drawing his attention back to her stall. She had finally settled enough to accept small amounts of feed, though her protective instincts remained strong. Each time someone entered the barn, her ears would prick forward. Her eyes would track their movement, as if she was still guarding secrets yet to be revealed. Dr. Martinez continued her methodical documentation, photographing and sampling evidence that would later prove crucial in multiple criminal trials. The injection sites, the blood work anomalies, the genetic testing results, each piece added to a picture of systematic abuse and fraud that spanned years and crossed state lines. But it was the contents of Amy Thompson's voice recorder that would prove to be the most damning evidence of all. As FBI technicians worked to enhance the audio, a story began to emerge of late-night breeding sessions with supposedly dead stallions, of performance-enhancing drug protocols disguised as routine veterinary care, and of a young rider who had discovered too much and had to be silenced. The quarantine barn's security cameras recorded every moment of the horses' recovery, their footage securing a chain of evidence that would eventually lead to one of the largest criminal indictments in equestrian history. But for now, as the first rays of dawn broke over Whispering Pines Valley, John Miller focused on the immediate needs of the animals in his care, knowing that their testimony, written in scars, needle marks, and DNA, would soon expose a darkness that had been hiding behind Crystal Creek's prestigious facade. At Whispering Pines Regional Medical Center, Amy Thompson lay propped up in her hospital bed, her bruised face a stark contrast to the crisp white sheets. Despite her injuries, her eyes were clear and focused as she began to share her story with Sheriff Cooper and Agent Chen. The steady beeping of medical monitors provided a rhythm to her revelation, each detail more disturbing than the last. "I noticed the discrepancies in the breeding records first," Amy explained, her voice hoarse but determined. Mares that were supposedly in one location showing up in competition photos at completely different venues. Foals registered to stallions that were reportedly deceased. She paused, taking a careful sip of water. But it was the night logs that really caught my attention. As Crystal Creek's head trainer, Amy had access to areas of the facility that others didn't. Late one evening, she discovered a hidden section of the stable complex, carefully concealed behind what appeared to be a storage building. Inside, she found state-of-the-art breeding equipment and horses that had supposedly died in various accidents over the past 2 years. They were keeping the most valuable stallions there, she continued, her hands twisting in the hospital blanket. Insurance paid out millions on their deaths, but Reynolds was still breeding them secretly. The foals would be registered using falsified DNA records, then sold through a network of shell companies. She reached for her phone, then remembered it was now evidence in the FBI's possession. Agent Chen's team had already begun unraveling the complex web of financial transactions. Summit Equestrian Group had subsidiaries scattered across multiple states, each involved in different aspects of the scheme. The breeding operation was just one part of a larger criminal enterprise that included insurance fraud, illegal gambling on fixed races, and money laundering through horse sales. But it got worse. Amy's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. They started experimenting with genetic manipulation, trying to create super horses by tampering with DNA and using banned substances. That's what they were doing to Midnight Serenade and her foal. They weren't just breeding them, they were trying to engineer the perfect racehorse no matter the cost to the animals. Sheriff Cooper's phone buzzed with updates from Dr. Martinez. The detailed blood work had confirmed Amy's accusations. The horses showed traces of experimental compounds that hadn't even been documented in veterinary literature. The foal's genetic tests revealed markers that suggested direct manipulation of its DNA, a practice strictly forbidden in both racing and breeding. I started gathering evidence, Amy continued, her strength seeming to grow as she shared her burden. Recording conversations, photographing documents, tracking shipments of unmarked veterinary supplies. I thought I was being careful, but she touched her bruised face gently. They caught me in the office after hours. I only escaped because of Midnight Serenade. The mare, it turned out, had been more than just a victim. When Amy's captors had dragged her to the hidden stable complex, planning to make her disappearance look like another tragic accident, Midnight Serenade had broken free from her stall. In the chaos that followed, Amy had managed to grab her evidence and escape with the horses. She protected me, Amy's voice filled with emotion. Even weak from their experiments, she kept herself between me and them. We ran into the storm because it was our only chance. I thought we'd freeze to death, but she led us to your ranch. She looked at John Miller, who had joined them after ensuring the horses were stable. Somehow, she knew where to find help. Outside, the hospital room, the story was already breaking across national news networks. Aerial footage showed FBI teams surrounding Crystal Creek stables, leading away staff members in handcuffs as they executed search warrants. The hidden breeding facility had been discovered, along with computers containing detailed records of the entire operation. Marcus Reynolds had vanished, but his escape wouldn't last long. The evidence Amy had gathered, combined with the physical proof provided by the rescued horses, had triggered investigations in multiple states. Bank records were being frozen, properties seized, and search warrants executed across the country. Back at Sunrise Ranch, Dr. Martinez continued her work with the rescued horses. Each new test revealed more details about the extent of Crystal Creek's experiments. The yearling's accelerated growth had been achieved through a dangerous combination of genetic modification and banned substances, pushing its development far beyond natural limits. They were playing God, Dr. Martinez explained to the gathered investigators, pointing to slides showing cellular damage, trying to create horses that could run faster, breed earlier, and sell for millions, but the physical cost to the animals. She shook her head, anger evident in her professional demeanor. Some of these procedures, these drugs, they're not even tested. We have no idea what the long-term effects might be. The foal had become a central piece of evidence. Its genetic makeup showed clear signs of direct DNA manipulation, something that had never been successfully attempted in horses before. The implications for the racing industry were staggering. If Crystal Creek had perfected these techniques, they could have created an entire line of genetically enhanced horses, undetectable through standard testing. John Miller's quarantine barn had become a secure facility, guarded by FBI agents around the clock. The horses' recovery was being carefully documented, every improvement or setback potentially crucial to the growing case. Midnight Serenade, despite her ordeal, showed remarkable resilience. Her protective instincts remained strong, but she had begun to trust John and Dr. Martinez, allowing them to provide the care she and her foal desperately needed. The investigation was expanding beyond Crystal Creek. Other prestigious stables were being scrutinized, their records examined for connections to Summit Equestrian Group. The racing industry, already struggling with doping scandals, faced a crisis of confidence. How many other facilities were conducting similar experiments? How many champions had been created in secret laboratories rather than careful breeding programs? Amy Thompson's recovery would take time, but her courage in exposing the truth had already set in motion changes that would reshape the equestrian world. New regulations were being drafted, testing protocols enhanced, and oversight committees formed. The dark side of horse breeding had been dragged into the light, and the industry would never be the same. In the quiet moments between medical treatments and FBI interviews, Amy would sit with Midnight Serenade in the quarantine barn. The mare's gentle nickering and watchful presence seemed to heal something deeper than physical wounds. Together, they had survived not just a winter storm, but an encounter with human greed and cruelty that had nearly cost them everything. The breakthrough in locating Marcus Reynolds came from an unexpected source. A small-town feed store owner in Wyoming recognized him from the news, not as the polished CEO shown in press photos, but as a harried man buying basic horse supplies with cash. The FBI's tactical team moved in swiftly, surrounding the remote ranch where Reynolds had been hiding. He had taken with him something far more valuable than money, a laptop containing the complete records of Summit Equestrian Group's illegal operations. The encryption was military-grade, Agent Chen explained during the emergency briefing at the FBI's Mobile Command Center. But our tech team managed to crack it. What we found goes beyond anything we initially suspected. She pulled up a series of documents on the main screen, revealing a network that stretched across 3 continents. The genetic manipulation program at Crystal Creek had been just one part of a global operation. Reynolds had connections to underground laboratories in Eastern Europe, where banned research into equine genetic engineering had been ongoing for years. The DNA profiles of supposedly dead champion horses had been used to create what Reynolds called in his private notes the next evolution of thoroughbreds. Sheriff Cooper studied the financial records with growing concern. The money trail leads through dozens of shell companies, but look at these names. She pointed to a list of investors. These are some of the biggest names in racing. People who sit on regulatory boards, who influence testing protocols. John Miller had been called to the briefing to provide his expertise on horse rehabilitation. His military background proved unexpectedly valuable as they analyzed Reynolds' operation. These protocols, he said, examining the breeding program documents, they're using military research principles, applying battlefield medical advances to push the limits of equine genetics. The implications were staggering. Reynolds hadn't just been creating enhanced horses. He had been developing techniques that could transform the entire industry. The FBI's forensic accountants had traced over $300 million in transactions, all carefully hidden behind legitimate racing operations. At Crystal Creek, the evidence recovery teams had discovered a hidden laboratory beneath the main stable complex. State-of-the-art equipment, much of it unauthorized for veterinary use, filled the sterile space. Vials of experimental compounds lined refrigerated storage units, each carefully labeled with codes that corresponded to entries in Reynolds' database. Dr. Martinez spent hours analyzing the seized research data. They were combining cutting-edge genetic modification with traditional breeding, she explained, her voice tight with professional outrage. Using banned substances to mask the changes, then creating false DNA profiles to register the offspring. Every major competition could have been compromised. The yearlings' blood work had provided the key to understanding their methods. The accelerated growth hadn't just been about reaching racing age faster. It was a test run for more ambitious modifications. Reynolds' notes revealed plans to create horses with enhanced muscle density, improved oxygen processing, and altered pain responses. He saw himself as a pioneer, Agent Chen said, reading from Reynolds' private correspondence. He wrote about freeing the industry from outdated limitations and unleashing the true potential of equine genetics. He actually believed he was helping the sport evolve. Amy Thompson, now released from the hospital, had joined the investigation team at John's ranch. Her knowledge of Crystal Creek's operations proved invaluable as they pieced together the extent of Reynolds' network. The legitimate breeding program was just a cover, she explained, gently stroking Midnight Serenade's neck. The real work happened after hours in that hidden lab. They kept 2 sets of books, 2 sets of DNA records, 2 of everything. The mare's recovery had become a symbol of hope for the investigation team. Despite the trauma she had endured, Midnight Serenade showed remarkable improvement under John's care. Her coat regained its shine, her eyes brightened, and her protective instincts gradually softened into gentle affection. The foal, though still dealing with the effects of genetic manipulation, grew stronger each day. International law enforcement agencies had joined the investigation, raiding connected facilities across Europe and Asia. The scope of Reynolds' operation stunned even experienced investigators. Champion horses that had been declared dead were discovered alive in hidden stables, their DNA being harvested for ongoing experiments. The racing industry faced its greatest crisis since the advent of drug testing. Questions arose about the legitimacy of major victories, the integrity of breeding lines, and the very future of the sport. Reynolds' network had touched every level of competition, from small regional tracks to prestigious international events. Back at Sunrise Ranch, John Miller had begun implementing a specialized rehabilitation program for the rescued horses. His experience with traumatized military service animals proved invaluable as they worked to undo the physical and psychological damage inflicted by Crystal Creek's experiments. "They're not just evidence anymore," he explained to Agent Chen as they watched Midnight Serenade and her foal in the paddock. "They're survivors who need to learn how to be horses again, how to trust, how to play, how to live without fear of the next injection or procedure." The FBI had converted one of John's outbuildings into a secure evidence storage facility. Hundreds of samples, documents, and hard drives filled the climate-controlled space. Each piece told part of the story of how ambition and greed had corrupted. One of the world's oldest sports, Amy Thompson, spent more time at the ranch, working with John to rehabilitate the horses she had helped save. Her testimony would be crucial in the upcoming trials, but for now, her focus was on healing, both for herself and the animals that had suffered alongside her. "Midnight Serenade knew," she said one evening, watching the mare guide her foal through basic training exercises. Even when they were experimenting on her, she never lost her spirit. She protected her foal, she protected me, and in the end, she exposed their whole operation. The investigation had revealed another layer of tragedy. Dozens of horses had died during Reynolds' experiments, their bodies quietly disposed of when the modifications proved too extreme for survival. The records showed a callous disregard for animal welfare, with test subjects reduced to numbers in a spreadsheet. As federal prosecutors prepared their cases, the equestrian community began the difficult process of reform. New testing protocols were developed, oversight committees were restructured, and regulations around breeding documentation were strengthened. The scandal had exposed dangerous vulnerabilities in the system, but it had also sparked a movement for genuine change. Marcus Reynolds' trial began on a cold autumn morning. The federal courthouse in Helena packed with journalists, industry officials, and members of the equestrian community. The prosecution's opening statement laid bare the scope of his crimes: conspiracy, animal cruelty, fraud, money laundering, and violations of multiple international breeding regulations. Each charge carried the weight of years of meticulous investigation. Amy Thompson sat in the front row, her presence a testament to survival. Beside her, John Miller provided silent support, his military bearing a stark contrast to the polished attorneys and racing officials filling the courtroom. The evidence they had helped uncover would form the backbone of the government's case. The defendant didn't just break the law, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez began, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. He tried to rewrite the fundamental rules of nature itself. His experiments didn't just harm individual horses, they threatened the integrity of an entire industry and the safety of everyone involved in it. The prosecution's first exhibits included detailed photographs of the hidden laboratory beneath Crystal Creek stables. The sterile space, with its advanced genetic sequencing equipment and carefully organized samples, looked more like a military research facility than part of a horse breeding operation. Expert witnesses explained how Reynolds had combined legitimate veterinary procedures with banned experimental techniques. Dr. Rebecca Martinez took the stand early in the proceedings, her testimony providing the scientific foundation for the prosecution's case. She walked the jury through the complex world of equine genetics, explaining how Reynolds' team had manipulated DNA sequences to enhance specific traits while concealing their modifications from standard testing protocols. The damage wasn't just physical, she explained, pointing to slides showing cellular abnormalities in tissue samples from the rescued horses. These alterations created cascading effects throughout their bodies. The yearlings' accelerated growth came at the cost of potentially devastating joint problems. The foal's enhanced muscle development is already showing signs of strain on its cardiovascular system. The financial evidence proved equally damning. FBI forensic accountants had traced hundreds of millions of dollars through a labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell companies. Insurance claims for supposedly dead horses had funded the purchase of more breeding stock and laboratory equipment. Prestigious races had been won by horses carrying genetic modifications that gave them invisible advantages. Reynolds sat impassively at the defense table, his once immaculate appearance now weathered by months in custody. His attorneys attempted to paint him as a visionary whose methods, while unorthodox, were aimed at advancing equine science. They argued that genetic modification was an inevitable next step in breeding evolution, but the prosecution had an answer for every defense. They called trainers who had quit Crystal Creek rather than participate in the experimental programs. Former employees testified about late-night procedures conducted behind locked doors, about horses that disappeared after failed modifications, about the pressure to maintain absolute secrecy. The turning point came when Amy Thompson took the stand. Her voice steady. Despite the emotion of the moment, she recounted her discovery of the hidden breeding program and her harrowing escape. The voice recorder she had carried that night provided crucial audio evidence, capturing conversations that directly implicated Reynolds in ordering both the experiments and her silencing. "I heard them talking about making her disappearance look like an accident," Amy testified, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Just like they had done with other people who asked too many questions. That's when I knew I had to run, had to take whatever evidence I could gather." The defense tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting she had stolen proprietary breeding information for competitors. But they couldn't explain away the physical evidence. The rescued horses, the laboratory data, the financial records that corroborated every detail of her story. John Miller's testimony focused on the rehabilitation of the rescued horses. His experience with traumatized military animals lent weight to his descriptions of their physical and psychological recovery. He explained how Midnight Serenade's protective behavior had evolved from desperate fear to cautious trust, marking the slow healing of deep wounds. These horses didn't just suffer physical abuse, he told the jury, his military bearing adding authority to his words. They endured systematic torture in the name of profit. Every injection, every procedure, every manipulation was about creating perfect racing machines, regardless of the cost to the animals themselves. The prosecution's evidence included hours of surveillance footage from Crystal Creek's hidden cameras, showing Reynolds personally overseeing experimental procedures. In one particularly damning video, he could be heard dismissing concerns about a horse's obvious distress, demanding that the genetic modification protocol continue despite warning. Signs. International racing authorities presented testimony about the potential impact on competition results. Races worth millions in purse money and breeding rights had been won by horses carrying Reynolds' genetic modifications. The ripple effects touched every major track and breeding program in the world. The defense attempted to argue that genetic modification was simply an extension of traditional breeding practices, no different from selective breeding for desired traits. But expert witnesses demolished this argument, demonstrating how Reynolds's techniques had crossed fundamental ethical and biological lines. Dr. Martinez returned to the stand to present the latest findings from ongoing studies of the rescued horses. The foal's development continued to show concerning anomalies, its enhanced traits coming at the cost of other vital functions. The yearling's accelerated growth had created structural weaknesses that would require lifelong management. These weren't just experiments gone wrong, she explained, her professional composure masking deep anger. They were systematic attempts to create genetic advantages that could be passed down through generations. The potential damage to the species' genetic diversity is incalculable. The trial also exposed the network of enablers who had helped Reynolds build his operation. Racing officials had looked the other way when suspicious results emerged. Veterinarians had signed false death certificates for valuable horses. Insurance adjusters had expedited claims without proper investigation. As the prosecution built its case, the wider implications for the racing industry became clear. Reynolds' methods might have been extreme, but they had emerged from a culture that prioritized winning over welfare, profit over ethics. His defense team's attempts to normalize his actions only highlighted how far the sport had strayed from its traditions of horsemanship and care. The evidence gathered at Sunrise Ranch proved crucial in establishing the extent of the abuse. Detailed documentation of the horse's recovery, including before and after medical imaging, blood work, and behavioral assessments, painted a clear picture of the damage inflicted by Reynolds' experiments. The jury took less than 6 hours to reach their verdict. As the forewoman stood to deliver their decision, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Marcus Reynolds was found guilty on all counts, facing a potential sentence of up to 50 years in federal prison. The judge, noting the exceptional cruelty of his crimes, also ordered him to pay $75 million in restitution to a newly established fund for equine rehabilitation and welfare oversight. But Reynolds' conviction was just the beginning of a larger transformation within the equestrian world. The evidence presented during the trial had exposed systemic vulnerabilities that reached far beyond Crystal Creek stables. The International Federation for Equestrian Sports announced a complete overhaul of its testing and oversight protocols, implementing new genetic screening requirements for all registered breeding stock. At Sunrise Ranch, life had settled into a new rhythm. The quarantine barn, no longer needed for evidence preservation, had been converted into a specialized rehabilitation facility. Word of John Miller's success with the Crystal Creek survivors had spread, bringing requests from law enforcement and animal welfare organizations across the country. Each case teaches us something new, John explained to a group of visiting veterinary students. The horses show us how to help them heal if we're willing to listen. He led them to a paddock where Midnight Serenade and her foal grazed peacefully. The mare's coat gleamed in the autumn sunlight, bearing little resemblance to the desperate creature that had emerged from the storm that winter night. Amy Thompson had become a regular presence at the ranch, dividing her time between helping with rehabilitation work and advocating for stronger industry reforms. Her testimony had not only helped convict Reynolds, but had sparked a movement within the equestrian community. Young trainers and riders were speaking out about other ethical concerns, demanding greater transparency and accountability. It's not just about stopping illegal experiments, she told a congressional committee on animal welfare. It's about changing the culture that made those experiments seem acceptable to so many people. We need to remember that these aren't just athletes or investments, they're living beings deserving of our protection. The foal's development continued to challenge conventional veterinary knowledge. Dr. Martinez had established a research program dedicated to understanding and treating the effects of genetic manipulation in horses. The data gathered from treating the Crystal Creek survivors was helping create new protocols for identifying and addressing similar cases. "We're seeing effects we never anticipated," she reported during a veterinary conference. "The genetic modifications don't just affect physical traits, they impact behavior, emotional development, even basic survival instincts. Some changes appear to be hereditary, which raises serious concerns for future generations." International law enforcement continued to unravel Reynolds' global network. Raids in Eastern Europe had uncovered more hidden breeding facilities, each revealing new horrors. The scientific equipment seized from these operations showed that Crystal Creek's experiments had been part of a larger plan to create a new class of genetically enhanced competition horses. The yearling's recovery had become a symbol of hope for the rehabilitation program. Despite its traumatic start in life, it had developed into a gentle, intelligent animal. The physical challenges caused by accelerated growth required ongoing management, but its spirit remained unbroken. Under John's careful guidance, it had even begun basic training, showing a natural talent for working with other traumatized horses. Sheriff Sarah Cooper had expanded her department's animal welfare division using lessons learned from the Crystal Creek case to build a more effective response system. Her deputies received specialized training in recognizing signs of abuse and collecting evidence, creating a model program that other law enforcement agencies began to adopt. "We can't assume someone else will notice or speak up," she explained during a training session. "Every officer needs to understand that animal cruelty often connects to larger criminal enterprises." The Crystal Creek case proved that following these leads can expose networks we might never have discovered otherwise. The racing industry faced its own reckoning. Major competitions implemented mandatory genetic screening for all participants, while breeding registries required new levels of documentation and verification. The changes met resistance from some traditional powers in the sport, but the public pressure for reform proved overwhelming. The Sunrise Ranch Rehabilitation Program expanded to include a teaching component, sharing techniques developed during the Crystal Creek recovery with other facilities. Veterinarians, trainers, and law enforcement officers came to learn about identifying signs of genetic manipulation and helping affected animals heal. Midnight Serenade had become the heart of the program. Her journey from test subject to survivor to teacher touched everyone who worked with her. The mare's gentle guidance of other traumatized horses showed an emotional intelligence that transcended her genetic modifications. "She remembers everything," John observed, watching her coach a newly arrived rescue through its first days of rehabilitation. But she chooses to use those memories to help others heal. There's a lesson there for all of us. The government's seizure of Crystal Creek stables led to its transformation into a national equine welfare center. The same facilities that had once housed secret laboratories now supported research into ethical breeding practices and natural performance enhancement. The hidden underground complex was converted into a museum, preserving evidence of past abuses. To educate future generations, Amy's role in exposing the scandal had earned her both acclaim and opportunities. Major breeding programs sought her expertise in developing new welfare protocols, while animal rights organizations requested her testimony in support of stronger protection laws. But she found her true calling in working with young riders, teaching them to prioritize their horses' well-being over competitive success. What happened at Crystal Creek wasn't just about one man's greed, she would tell her students. It was about losing sight of why we fell in love with horses in the first place. When we focus only on winning, on pushing limits, we risk forgetting that these are living creatures who trust us with their lives. The foal's first birthday celebration became an unexpected media event. Journalists and industry officials gathered at Sunrise Ranch to witness the progress of the most well-documented survivor of genetic manipulation. Its healthy development, despite ongoing challenges, offered hope that even the most traumatized victims could find healing. John Miller's military background had prepared him for many challenges, but the emotional intensity of the rehabilitation work still surprised him. Each recovered horse carried its own story of survival, its own path to healing. The skills he'd learned helping service animals deal with combat trauma found new application in working with the survivors of human greed and ambition. The Crystal Greek case had opened a new chapter in equine welfare, one where the connection between human ambition and animal suffering could no longer be ignored. The changes rippling through the industry carried both challenge and promise, a chance to rebuild on a foundation of genuine care and respect for the animals that had given so much to human endeavors. 1 year after Reynolds' conviction, Sunrise Ranch hosted a national symposium on equine rehabilitation and welfare reform. Veterinarians, trainers, and animal welfare advocates from across the country gathered to share knowledge and establish new standards of care. The conference center, built with funds from Reynolds' restitution payments, stood as a testament to how tragedy could be transformed into positive change. Dr. Martinez presented her latest research findings, documenting the long-term effects of genetic manipulation on horse development. The data gathered from treating the Crystal Creek survivors had revolutionized understanding of equine genetics and the potential consequences of attempting to enhance performance through DNA modification. We're still discovering new aspects of these modifications, she explained, pointing to detailed genetic maps displayed on the conference room screens. The changes don't just affect the targeted traits, they create ripple effects throughout the entire genetic structure. Some alterations appear to become more pronounced with each generation, raising serious concerns about the future of affected bloodlines. The yearling, now approaching its second birthday, provided living proof of both the dangers and the possibilities of rehabilitation. Its physical challenges required ongoing management, but under John Miller's care, it had developed into an ambassador for the program. New arrivals at the ranch often found their first comfort in the gentle presence of this fellow survivor. Amy Thompson's role had evolved beyond her original position as a key witness. She had become a leading voice in the movement for industry reform, combining her technical knowledge with personal experience to advocate for stronger protections. Her testimony before state legislatures had helped pass new laws governing equine welfare and breeding practices. The Crystal Creek case showed us what happens when we prioritize profit over welfare, she told a packed auditorium. But it also showed us the incredible resilience of these animals and their capacity to heal when given the chance. Every survivor here represents both a warning and a promise. Midnight Serenade's recovery had become legendary in rehabilitation circles. The mare's transformation from terrified victim to confident mentor inspired similar programs across the country. Her ability to connect with traumatized horses demonstrated an emotional intelligence that challenged traditional understanding of equine psychology. Sheriff Cooper had expanded her department's animal welfare division into a full-time unit with specialized training and equipment. The lessons learned from the Crystal Creek investigation helped law enforcement agencies develop more effective protocols for identifying and investigating suspected abuse cases. We're seeing a fundamental shift in how these cases are handled, she explained during a law enforcement panel. Animal welfare investigations aren't sidebar issues anymore. They're often gateways to discovering larger criminal enterprises. The Crystal Creek case proved that following these leads can expose networks we might never have found otherwise. The foal's development continued to provide valuable data for researchers studying the effects of genetic manipulation. Despite the challenges caused by its modified DNA, it had grown into a strong and surprisingly well-adjusted young horse. Regular monitoring showed how its body was adapting to changes that had never been documented in equine medicine before. John Miller's rehabilitation methods had gained international recognition. His combination of military precision and deep empathy created a unique approach to helping traumatized horses recover. Veterans groups began sending personnel to learn his techniques, recognizing parallels between animal and human trauma recovery. Each horse teaches us something new about healing, he observed, watching a group of recent arrivals in the rehabilitation paddock. They show us that recovery isn't just about physical healing. It's about rebuilding trust, rediscovering joy, learning to live without fear. The racing industry's reforms had met initial resistance, but ultimately led to stronger competition and improved welfare standards. Mandatory genetic screening had leveled the playing field, while enhanced monitoring systems helped prevent abuse. Before it could take root, the sport was slowly rebuilding its reputation on a foundation of ethical treatment and natural talent. The Sunrise Ranch teaching program had expanded to include international students sharing rehabilitation techniques. With facilities around the world, veterinarians and trainers came to learn about identifying signs of genetic manipulation and helping affected animals heal. The knowledge gained from treating the Crystal Creek survivors helped create new protocols for handling similar cases. Midnight Serenade's role in the program had evolved beyond anyone's expectations. Her intuitive understanding of other traumatized horses made her an invaluable asset in rehabilitation work. New arrivals often responded to her presence before they would accept human contact, finding comfort in her quiet strength. She remembers her own journey, Amy noted, watching the mare guide a nervous newcomer through its first day in the paddock. But she uses that memory to help others find their way back. That's the kind of healing we couldn't have planned or predicted. The government's transformation of Crystal Creek Stables into a national equine welfare center represented a physical manifestation of the industry's changes. Research laboratories once used for illegal experiments now supported studies in ethical breeding and natural performance enhancement. The underground complex that had housed Reynolds' secret operations became an educational facility, teaching future generations about the importance of vigilance and compassion. The Crystal Creek case had sparked a broader conversation about humanity's relationship with animals in competitive sports. Other disciplines began examining their own practices, leading to reforms in everything from dog racing to show jumping. The emphasis shifted from pushing physical limits to celebrating the natural abilities of well-cared-for animals. Dr. Martinez's ongoing research revealed increasingly complex patterns in the genetic modifications. Some changes appeared to strengthen over generations, while others created unexpected vulnerabilities. Her work helped establish new guidelines for breeding programs, ensuring that pursuit of desired traits didn't compromise animal welfare. The foal's first public appearance at a major equestrian event marked a milestone in the recovery program. Its presence demonstrated both the dangers of genetic manipulation and the possibility of rehabilitation. Spectators who came expecting to see a victim instead witnessed a confident young horse, its modified genetics neither defining nor limiting its future. John's military background had proven unexpectedly valuable in developing rehabilitation protocols. The discipline and structure that helped veterans cope with trauma translated effectively to working with abused horses. His methods emphasized patience, consistency, and respect for each animal's individual journey toward healing. The Crystal Creek survivors had become living testaments to both human cruelty and compassion. Their stories, documented in medical records and behavioral studies, helped shape new approaches to animal welfare and rehabilitation. Each recovery provided hope that even the deepest wounds could heal with proper care and understanding. International cooperation in tracking down Reynolds' remaining associates continued to uncover new aspects of the scandal. Facilities in Eastern Europe and Asia were shut down, their equipment confiscated and their records added to the growing body of evidence about illegal genetic manipulation in the equestrian world. The Sunrise Ranch Rehabilitation Program had grown to include a dedicated research component, studying the long-term effects of trauma and recovery in horses. The data gathered helped create more effective treatment protocols, while the success stories inspired other facilities to adopt similar approaches. Marcus Reynolds' sentencing hearing drew international attention, not just for its legal significance, but for what it represented to the equestrian community. The courthouse overflowed with spectators as victims' impact statements painted a devastating picture of the damage his experiments had caused. When Amy Thompson rose to speak, her voice carried the weight of both personal experience and professional insight. These horses couldn't speak for themselves, she testified, her eyes meeting Reynolds across the courtroom. They couldn't tell us about the pain, the fear, the confusion of having their very DNA altered for profit. But they showed us, in every trembling approach, every defensive reaction, every hard-won moment of trust, exactly what your ambition cost them. The judge's sentence exceeded even the prosecution's recommendations. Beyond the 50 years in federal prison, Reynolds was permanently banned from any involvement with animals or genetic research. The court ordered the seizure of all his remaining assets, directing them toward establishing a permanent foundation for equine welfare and rehabilitation. At Sunrise Ranch, the impact of the case continued to ripple outward. The rehabilitation program had grown to include a state-of-the-art veterinary research center where Dr. Martinez led studies into the long-term effects of genetic manipulation. The data gathered from treating the Crystal Creek survivors was helping develop new protocols for identifying and addressing similar cases worldwide. "We're seeing patterns we never anticipated," Dr. Martinez explained during a research symposium. "The genetic modifications don't just affect physical characteristics. They influence behavior, emotional development, even basic survival instincts. Some changes appear to strengthen across generations, while others create unexpected vulnerabilities." The yearling's progress had become a focal point of the research. Now approaching maturity, it displayed both the promises and perils of genetic enhancement. Its exceptional strength and speed came with joint issues that required constant monitoring, while its accelerated development had created unique challenges in its social interactions with other horses. John Miller's rehabilitation methods had evolved to address these complex cases. His experience with military service animals provided a foundation for understanding trauma, while the Crystal Creek survivors taught him new approaches to healing. The program now included specialized protocols for horses affected by genetic manipulation, combining physical therapy with behavioral rehabilitation. "Each case is unique," he explained to a group of visiting veterinary students. "But they all share a common need: to be seen as individuals, not experiments. These horses have to relearn what it means to be horses, to trust their own instincts again." Midnight Serenade's role in the program had become almost legendary. The mare's ability to connect with traumatized newcomers demonstrated an emotional intelligence that surpassed ordinary horse behavior. Her gentle guidance helped other survivors navigate their own recovery journeys, showing them that healing was possible. Amy had transformed her experience into a mission for reform. She traveled internationally, speaking at conferences and consulting with breeding programs about ethical practices. Her testimony helped shape new regulations governing equine welfare, while her work with young riders emphasized the importance of prioritizing animal well-being over competitive success. The foal, now a striking young horse, carried physical markers of its modified genetics, but had developed a remarkable adaptability. Regular medical monitoring provided valuable data about how genetically enhanced horses aged and developed, while its gentle temperament challenged assumptions about the behavioral effects of DNA manipulation. Sheriff Cooper's Animal Welfare Unit had become a model for law enforcement agencies nationwide. The lessons learned from the Crystal Creek case helped create new protocols for investigating suspected abuse, while partnerships with veterinary experts improved evidence collection and documentation. Animal welfare cases aren't isolated incidents, she emphasized during a law enforcement training session. They're often connected to larger criminal enterprises. The Crystal Creek investigation proved that following these leads can expose networks that traditional investigations might miss. The racing industry's reforms continued to face challenges, but showed promising results. Enhanced testing protocols identified attempts at genetic manipulation before horses could enter competition, while stricter breeding regulations helped prevent the development of new modified bloodlines, international cooperation had led to the discovery of more facilities connected to Reynolds' network. Each raid uncovered new evidence of genetic experimentation, leading to additional prosecutions and the rescue of more affected horses. The global equestrian community began implementing standardized protocols for identifying and rehabilitating survivors. Dr. Martinez's research revealed increasingly complex patterns in the genetic modifications. Some changes appeared to stabilize over time, while others created cascading effects that manifested in unexpected ways. Her work helped establish new guidelines for breeding programs, ensuring that the pursuit of desired traits didn't compromise animal welfare. The Sunrise Ranch Rehabilitation Program expanded to include a teaching component, sharing techniques developed during the Crystal Creek recovery with other facilities. Veterinarians, trainers, and law enforcement officers came to learn about identifying signs of genetic manipulation and helping affected animals heal. Midnight Serenade's influence extended beyond individual rehabilitation cases. Her behavior provided valuable insights into how genetic modifications affected social dynamics among horses. Her ability to form strong bonds with other survivors challenged prevailing theories about the emotional capacity of enhanced animals. The government's conversion of Crystal Creek Stables into a national equine welfare center represented a physical transformation of the industry's darkest chapter. Research laboratories once used for illegal experiments now supported studies in ethical breeding and natural performance enhancement. The underground complex became an educational facility, preserving evidence of past abuses to prevent future exploitation. The Crystal Creek case had catalyzed a broader examination of human-animal relationships in competitive sports. Other disciplines began reviewing their practices, leading to reforms in various equestrian events. The emphasis shifted from maximizing performance to celebrating the natural abilities of well-cared-for animals. John's combination of military, discipline, and deep empathy created a unique approach to rehabilitation. His methods emphasized structure and consistency while remaining flexible enough to accommodate each animal's individual needs. The success of his program attracted attention from veterans groups interested in incorporating animal therapy into trauma recovery. The foal's development continued to provide valuable data for researchers studying the effects of genetic manipulation. Regular monitoring showed how its modified systems adapted to normal growth and development, while behavioral observations helped understand the psychological impact of enhanced capabilities. Amy's advocacy work led to the establishment of new industry standards for breeding and training. Her experiences with the Crystal Creek survivors helped create guidelines that balanced competitive goals with animal welfare, ensuring that future generations of horses wouldn't face similar exploitation. The impact of the case extended into veterinary education, with many schools adding courses on identifying and treating genetically modified animals. The lessons learned from treating the Crystal Creek survivors became part of the standard curriculum, preparing future veterinarians to handle similar cases. 2 years after Reynolds' conviction, Sunrise Ranch hosted a landmark celebration marking multiple milestones in the aftermath of the Crystal Creek case. The event brought together survivors, advocates, researchers, and supporters from around the world. all gathering to witness the dedication of the new International Equine Welfare Research Centre, funded entirely by the assets seized from Reynolds' criminal enterprise. The morning sun cast long shadows across the newly constructed facility as John Miller led visitors through the rehabilitation areas. The quarantine barn, where it had all begun, now served as just one part of a comprehensive treatment complex. Each section represented a different stage of recovery, from initial assessment to final rehabilitation. What started with 3 frightened horses in a snowstorm has grown into something we never could have imagined, John explained to the assembled guests. Every survivor who comes through these gates teaches us something new about resilience, about healing, and about the incredible capacity these animals have to overcome trauma. Midnight Serenade, now a commanding presence in the rehabilitation program, demonstrated her remarkable abilities during a special presentation. Visitors watched in amazement as she guided a recently rescued horse through its first interaction with handlers, showing an intuitive understanding of when to intervene and when to step back. Dr. Martinez unveiled groundbreaking research findings during the symposium portion of the event. Her team had mapped the complete genetic profile of the Crystal Creek survivors, creating the world's first comprehensive database of equine genetic manipulation markers. This work was already helping identify other cases of illegal enhancement around the globe. The modifications we've documented show patterns that could only have come from deliberate manipulation, she explained, pointing to complex DNA sequences displayed on the conference room screens. But what's more significant is how these changes interact with natural development over time. Some enhanced traits actually diminish with age, while others become more pronounced in unexpected ways. The yearling, now a striking 3-year-old, provided living proof of both the dangers and possibilities of rehabilitation. Though still dealing with the physical effects of accelerated growth, it had developed into an ambassador for the program. Its gentle demeanor and intelligence helped newcomers adjust to the rehabilitation process. Amy Thompson's presentation focused on the human element of the case, addressing the culture that had allowed such abuse to flourish. She spoke about the pressure to win at any cost, the willingness to overlook suspicious practices, and the importance of creating environments where speaking up about abuse was encouraged rather than punished. The real challenge isn't just preventing another Crystal Creek, she told the audience. It's changing the mindset that made it possible in the first place. Every person who works with horses needs to understand that their first responsibility is to the animal's welfare, not to competition results or profit margins. Sheriff Cooper's Animal Welfare Unit had expanded into a full division, with specialized investigators trained in recognizing signs of genetic manipulation and other forms of sophisticated abuse. Their protocols, developed during the Crystal Creek investigation, had been adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country. We're seeing a fundamental shift in how these cases are handled, she explained during a law enforcement panel. Animal welfare investigations aren't peripheral anymore. They're often the key to uncovering larger criminal enterprises. The Crystal Creek case proved that following these leads can expose networks that traditional investigations might miss. The foal, now a maturing young horse, continued to provide valuable data about the long-term effects of genetic enhancement. Regular medical monitoring showed how its modified systems adapted to normal growth and development, while behavioral observations helped understand the psychological impact of enhanced capabilities. International cooperation had led to the shutdown of multiple facilities connected to Reynolds' network. Each raid uncovered new evidence of genetic experimentation, leading to additional prosecutions and the rescue of more affected horses. The global equestrian community had implemented standardized protocols for identifying and rehabilitating survivors. The racing industry's reforms showed promising results in their third year of implementation. Enhanced testing protocols successfully identified attempts at genetic manipulation before horses could enter competition, while stricter breeding regulations helped prevent the development of new, modified bloodlines. John's rehabilitation methods had gained recognition beyond the equestrian world. Veterans groups studied his techniques for insights into trauma recovery, while mental health professionals explored the possibilities of incorporating similar approaches into human therapy programs. The principles are universal, he explained during a workshop session. Whether you're dealing with a horse that's survived abuse or a person who's experienced trauma, the key elements are the same: establishing safety, building trust, and allowing the individual to set the pace of their own recovery. Dr. Martinez's ongoing research revealed increasingly complex patterns in the genetic modifications. Some changes appeared to stabilize over time, while others created cascading effects that manifested in unexpected ways. Her work helped establish new guidelines for breeding programs, ensuring that the pursuit of desired traits didn't compromise animal welfare. The government's transformation of Crystal Creek Stables into a national equine welfare center stood as a physical symbol of the industry's commitment to reform. Research laboratories once used for illegal experiments now supported studies in ethical breeding and natural performance enhancement. Midnight Serenade's influence extended beyond individual rehabilitation cases. Her behavior provided valuable insights into how genetic modifications affected social dynamics among horses. Her ability to form strong bonds with other survivors challenged prevailing theories about the emotional capacity of enhanced animals. The Sunrise Ranch teaching program had expanded to include international students, sharing rehabilitation techniques with facilities around the world. Veterinarians, trainers, and law enforcement officers came to learn about identifying signs of genetic manipulation and helping affected animals heal. The Crystal Creek case had catalyzed a broader examination of human-animal relationships in competitive sports. Other disciplines began reviewing their practices, leading to reforms in various equestrian events. The emphasis shifted from maximizing performance to celebrating the natural abilities of well-cared-for animals. The impact of the case extended into veterinary education, with many schools adding courses on identifying and treating genetically modified animals. The lessons learned from treating the Crystal Creek survivors became part of the standard curriculum, preparing future veterinarians to handle similar cases. As the celebration drew to a close, the gathered community reflected on how far they had come from that stormy winter night when 3 desperate horses sought shelter at Sunrise Ranch. What had begun as a single act of compassion had grown into a movement that transformed an industry and redefined the relationship between humans and horses in competitive sports. 3 years after the Crystal Creek discovery, the story took an unexpected turn when international investigators uncovered a hidden archive of Reynolds' early research. The documents, found in a climate-controlled storage facility in Switzerland, revealed that Crystal Creek hadn't been his first attempt at genetic manipulation. A trail of failed experiments stretched back nearly a decade, involving facilities across 3 continents. John Miller stood in his office at Sunrise Ranch, studying the photographs federal agents had shared from the Swiss facility. The images showed detailed records of genetic modification attempts that had never been publicly revealed. Each file represented not just scientific data, but the suffering of animals whose stories had remained untold until now. These aren't just laboratory notes, Agent Chen explained during an emergency briefing at the FBI's Mobile Command Center. They're a roadmap of Reynolds' evolution as an experimenter. We can trace how he refined his techniques, how he learned to hide the physical signs of manipulation. There could be enhanced horses competing right now that we haven't identified. Dr. Martinez worked through the night, analyzing the newly discovered data. The documents showed how Reynolds had gradually developed the techniques used at Crystal Creek, each iteration becoming more sophisticated and harder to detect. More disturbing were the records of failed experiments. Horses whose bodies had rejected the genetic modifications with devastating consequences. He was using a trial and error approach, she explained to the assembled team, her voice tight with controlled anger. Each failure taught him how to make the next attempt more successful. The horses we rescued from Crystal Creek weren't just victims, they were the culmination of years of refined experimentation. Midnight Serenade's blood work took on new significance in light of the discovered records. The mare's genetic profile matched patterns documented in Reynolds' earlier experiments, suggesting she had been part of his program far longer than initially suspected. Her survival and subsequent recovery became even more remarkable given the extent of manipulation she had endured. Amy Thompson's testimony had to be updated for ongoing prosecutions. The new evidence supported her original observations while revealing that Crystal Creek's operation had been more extensive than anyone had realized. Her understanding of the stable's daily operations helped investigators interpret Reynolds' coded research notes. He didn't just hide the physical experiments, she explained during a supplementary deposition. He created an entire shadow breeding program, using legitimate competitions as cover for testing his modified horses. Every successful show was data for his next round of experiments. The yearling's development continued to provide crucial information about the long-term effects of genetic enhancement. Regular monitoring showed how its modified systems adapted to normal growth and development, while behavioral observations helped understand the psychological impact of enhanced capabilities. Sheriff Cooper's Animal Welfare Unit expanded their investigation to include cold cases that might be connected to Reynolds' earlier work. The newly discovered documents provided context for suspicious incidents that had previously been dismissed as accidents or natural deaths. We're reopening cases going back 10 years, she announced during a multi-agency briefing. Any unexplained horse death, any unusual competition result, any breeding program that suddenly shut down, it all needs to be re-examined in light of this new information. The foal's genetic profile revealed markers that matched experiments documented in Reynolds' early research. The modifications weren't random enhancements, but carefully planned alterations based on years of trial and error. This discovery helped explain both its exceptional abilities and its ongoing health challenges. International cooperation intensified as law enforcement agencies traced the network of facilities mentioned in the Swiss archives. Each location represented a potential crime scene, and the race began to secure evidence before Reynolds' remaining associates could destroy it. The racing industry faced another wave of scrutiny as investigators identified competitions where Reynolds had tested his enhanced horses. Results dating back years were called into question, leading to a comprehensive review of major races and breeding records. John's rehabilitation methods evolved to address the complex patterns of trauma revealed in the archived documents. His experience with military service animals provided a foundation for understanding how prolonged experimentation affected behavior and recovery. These horses weren't just physically modified, he explained during a training session for new staff. They were subjected to years of systematic manipulation. Their trauma isn't just about what was done to their bodies. It's about having their most basic natural instincts altered for human gain. Dr. Martinez's research team began mapping the progression of genetic modifications documented in the archives. The data showed how Reynolds had refined his techniques, building on each experiment to create increasingly sophisticated enhancements. The Sunrise Ranch Rehabilitation Program adapted to incorporate lessons learned from the newly discovered information. Treatment protocols were updated to address the possibility of long-term genetic manipulation, while monitoring systems were enhanced to detect subtle signs of modification. Midnight Serenade's role in the program became even more significant as researchers understood the full extent of her genetic modification. Her ability to overcome years of experimentation and develop into a nurturing presence for other survivors demonstrated remarkable resilience. The government's investigation expanded to include financial institutions that had unknowingly facilitated Reynolds' early research. Banking records revealed a complex network of funding sources, suggesting that other wealthy individuals might have been involved in supporting his work. Amy's advocacy work took on new urgency as the scope of Reynolds' experiments became clear. She worked with international organizations to develop enhanced screening protocols, helping identify horses that might have been part of his earlier programs. The impact of the case reached into the highest levels of the equestrian world. Competition, organizers and breeding associations rushed to implement new testing procedures, while regulatory bodies strengthened oversight of genetic screening programs. John's military background proved invaluable in organizing the expanded rehabilitation effort. His experience with complex operations helped coordinate the various agencies and organizations now involved in identifying and treating survivors of genetic manipulation. The Crystal Creek survivors provided a baseline for understanding how modified horses aged and developed over time. Their progress helped researchers identify subtle markers that might indicate genetic enhancement in other horses. The discovery of Reynolds' archives led to a re-examination of accepted breeding practices throughout the industry. Techniques that had been considered standard came under scrutiny as awareness grew about the potential for abuse and manipulation. The international equestrian community faced difficult questions about its role in enabling Reynolds' experiments. The pressure to produce exceptional performance horses had created an environment where suspicious practices could flourish undetected. 5 years after the winter storm that exposed Crystal Creek's dark secrets, Sunrise Ranch hosted a final ceremony, marking the closure of the federal investigation. The event brought together everyone who had played a role in uncovering, investigating, and healing the aftermath of Reynolds' experiments. The ranch, now an internationally recognized center for equine rehabilitation and research, stood as a testament to how tragedy could be transformed into lasting positive change. Amy Thompson took the podium first, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd with the strength of someone who had found purpose in adversity. When I first discovered what was happening at Crystal Creek, I couldn't imagine how deep the corruption went or how far the healing would reach. Today, we're not just celebrating the end of an investigation, we're celebrating a complete transformation in how we think about our relationship with these magnificent animals. John Miller watched from the side of the stage, his military bearing softened by years of working with traumatized horses. Beside him stood Midnight Serenade, now a legendary figure in the rehabilitation community. The mayor's presence at the ceremony represented everything they had fought to achieve: dignity restored, trust rebuilt, and wisdom gained through adversity. Dr. Martinez presented the final comprehensive report on the Crystal Creek survivors, a document that would become the foundation for future research into genetic manipulation in horses. The data we've gathered over these 5 years has revolutionized our understanding of both the dangers and the resilience of equine genetics. Every survivor has taught us something new about the complexity of healing. The yearling, now a mature horse, demonstrated its remarkable journey during a special presentation. Despite the physical challenges caused by genetic manipulation, it had developed into a gentle teacher, helping newcomers to the rehabilitation program navigate their own recovery. Its story became a powerful symbol of how trauma could be transformed into strength. Sheriff Cooper's Animal Welfare Division had grown into a national model for law enforcement response to sophisticated animal abuse cases. The Crystal Creek investigation changed everything, she explained during the ceremony. It showed us that animal welfare cases aren't isolated incidents. They're often connected to larger criminal enterprises that require coordinated, multi-agency responses. The foal, reaching maturity under careful monitoring, provided living proof of both the dangers and possibilities of recovery from genetic manipulation. Its development challenged previous assumptions about the permanence of genetic modification, showing how proper care and understanding could help overcome even the most invasive alterations. International cooperation had led to the complete dismantling of Reynolds' global network. The final raids in Eastern Europe had uncovered the last remaining facilities connected to his early experiments, bringing closure to a dark chapter in equestrian history. The evidence gathered would continue to inform industry regulations and welfare protocols for generations to come. The racing industry emerged transformed from the scandal. New genetic screening protocols became standard practice, while enhanced monitoring systems helped prevent the development of new modified bloodlines. The emphasis shifted from pure performance to the ethical treatment and natural development of competition horses. John's rehabilitation methods had been adopted by facilities worldwide, combining his military precision with deep empathy for traumatized animals. "Every horse that comes through these gates carries a unique story," he told the assembled guests. "Our job isn't just to heal their bodies. It's to help them rediscover their natural instincts and rebuild their trust in humans." Dr. Martinez's research team had established the world's most comprehensive database of equine genetic manipulation markers. Their work helped create new standards for identifying and treating affected horses, while providing crucial evidence for ongoing legal cases against Reynolds' former associates. The Sunrise Ranch teaching program had become a cornerstone of international efforts to prevent future abuse. Veterinarians, trainers, and law enforcement officers from around the world came to learn about identifying signs of genetic manipulation and implementing effective rehabilitation protocols. Midnight Serenade's influence extended far beyond individual rehabilitation cases. Her remarkable ability to connect with traumatized horses had led to new understanding of equine emotional intelligence and social bonding. The mare's journey from victim to healer became a powerful example of resilience and recovery. The government's transformation of Crystal Creek Stables into a national equine welfare center represented the final chapter in the facility's redemption. Research laboratories once used for illegal experiments now supported studies in ethical breeding and natural performance enhancement, while the underground complex served as an educational museum, preserving evidence of past abuses to prevent future exploitation. The Crystal Creek case had catalyzed fundamental changes in how the equestrian world approached competition and breeding. Other disciplines began examining their own practices, leading to reforms that prioritized animal welfare over performance metrics. The emphasis shifted from pushing physical limits to celebrating the natural abilities of well-cared-for horses. Amy's advocacy work had helped establish new international standards for breeding and training. Her experiences with the Crystal Creek survivors informed guidelines that balanced competitive goals with animal welfare, ensuring that future generations of horses would be protected from similar exploitation. The impact of the case extended into veterinary education, with specialized courses on identifying and treating genetically modified animals becoming standard curriculum. The lessons learned from treating the Crystal Creek survivors helped prepare future veterinarians to handle complex cases of abuse and manipulation. As the ceremony drew to a close, John led Midnight Serenade to the newly dedicated memorial garden. Bronze plaques honored the horses who hadn't survived Reynolds' experiments, their stories preserved as stark reminders of the cost of unchecked ambition. The mare stood quietly beside him, her presence a living testament to the possibility of healing and redemption. The legacy of the Crystal Creek case would continue to influence the equestrian world for generations to come. What began with 3 desperate horses in a snowstorm had grown into a movement that transformed an industry's understanding of its responsibilities to the animals in its care. The story served as both a warning about the dangers of prioritizing achievement over welfare and a reminder of the extraordinary capacity for healing when humans choose to protect rather than exploit. As the sun set on the ceremony, the gathered community reflected on how far they had come and the work that still lay ahead. The Crystal Creek survivors had shown that even the deepest wounds could heal with proper care and understanding. Their legacy would live on in every rescued horse that found its way to safety, in every regulation that protected animal welfare, and in every person who chose to speak up against abuse. The story of Sunrise Ranch and the Crystal Creek survivors became more than just a tale of exposure and justice. It became a blueprint for transformation, showing how dedication, compassion, and unwavering commitment to animal welfare could turn tragedy into triumph. The horses that had once been victims of human greed had become teachers, showing the way toward a more ethical and compassionate future for all equestrian sports. In the final days of summer, Sunrise Ranch prepared for a historic transition. John Miller stood in the rehabilitation paddock, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds that had become far more than just a sanctuary. The ranch had evolved into an international symbol of hope and transformation, its legacy secure in the countless lives it had touched, both human and equine. "It's time," he announced to the gathered staff and volunteers, his voice carrying the weight of years dedicated to healing traumatized horses. "The next generation needs to take the reins." After 6 years of building and leading the world's premier equine rehabilitation center, John had decided to step into an advisory role, ensuring the program's future while making way for new leadership. Amy Thompson, who had grown from whistleblower to respected industry reformer, would take over as executive director. Her journey from Crystal Creek's head trainer to international advocate for equine welfare had prepared her perfectly for this role. "We'll honor everything you've built here, John," she promised, standing beside Midnight Serenade, the mare that had started it all. The final chapter of the Crystal Creek saga unfolded with a series of groundbreaking announcements. Dr. Martinez's research team had completed the most comprehensive study ever conducted on genetically modified horses, their findings revolutionizing understanding of both the dangers and the healing potential in equine genetics. "What we learned from these survivors will protect horses for generations to come," Dr. Martinez explained during her last presentation at the ranch. "Every challenge they faced, every step of their recovery, has helped us create better ways to identify and prevent abuse. Their legacy will live on in every protected horse, every prevented experiment, every preserved bloodline." Midnight Serenade, now approaching her senior years, had achieved almost mythical status in the rehabilitation community. Her intuitive ability to calm troubled horses and guide them through recovery had been documented in numerous scientific studies. She'd become living proof that even the deepest wounds could heal, that victims could become healers. The yearling, fully grown and thriving despite its challenging start, had developed into an ambassador for the program. Its gentle demeanor and remarkable intelligence helped newcomers adjust to rehabilitation, while its ongoing medical monitoring provided crucial data about the long-term effects of genetic modification. The foal, now a magnificent adult horse, represented something unprecedented in veterinary science, a genetically modified animal that had not only survived, but flourished under proper care. Its development challenged everything previously known about recovery from genetic manipulation, offering hope for other affected horses. Sheriff Cooper's Animal Welfare Division had expanded into a national training center, sharing the investigative techniques developed during the Crystal Creek case with law enforcement agencies worldwide. What we learned here changed how we approach animal abuse cases forever, she reflected. We now understand that these aren't isolated incidents. They're often windows into larger criminal enterprises. The racing industry's transformation had become a model for other equestrian sports. enhanced testing protocols, stricter breeding. Regulations and improved welfare standards had created a more ethical, competitive environment. The emphasis on natural ability and proper horse care had actually improved race times, proving that exploitation wasn't necessary for excellence. The impact of Crystal Creek reached beyond the equestrian world. The case had sparked reforms in various animal sports, from dog racing to show jumping. The principles developed at Sunrise Ranch, prioritizing animal welfare, maintaining transparent practices, and encouraging whistleblowers, became standard across all competitive fields involving animals. John's military-inspired rehabilitation methods had been refined and documented, creating a comprehensive approach to treating traumatized horses. His techniques combined structured recovery programs with individual attention to each animal's needs, an approach that proved successful with even the most severely abused cases. The government's conversion of Crystal Creek stables continued to evolve. The facility now housed the National Center for Equine Welfare, combining research laboratories, training facilities, and educational programs. The underground complex where Reynolds had conducted his experiments became a permanent museum, its dark history serving as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance. As John prepared to step back from daily operations, he spent more time working directly with the horses, especially the newest arrivals. Each case still touched him deeply, reminding him of that winter night when 3 desperate horses had sought shelter from the storm. Their courage had exposed a criminal enterprise and launched a movement that transformed an industry. The Sunrise Ranch rehabilitation program had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. What started as an emergency response to 3 abused horses had developed into an international network of facilities, all following the protocols and principles established during those first challenging months. Midnight Serenade's final contribution to the program came in the form of a groundbreaking study on equine emotional intelligence. Her ability to understand and respond to traumatized horses had led researchers to recognize previously unknown depths of horse cognition and empathy. Her work with other survivors would be studied for years to come. The Crystal Creek case had permanently changed how the equestrian world approached breeding and competition. The emphasis shifted from pushing physical limits to celebrating the natural bond between horses and humans. Performance remained important, but not at the cost of animal welfare. As the sun set on John's final day as director, the ranch hosted a quiet celebration. Staff members, volunteers, and supporters gathered to honor his legacy and welcome Amy's leadership. The horses in the rehabilitation paddocks moved peacefully in the evening light, their presence a testament to the healing power of compassion and dedication. This was never about just saving horses, John reflected, watching Midnight Serenade guide a nervous newcomer around the paddock. It was about changing how we see our responsibility to these magnificent animals. Every horse that finds healing here carries that message forward. The story of Crystal Creek and Sunrise Ranch became more than a cautionary tale about human greed or a triumph of justice. It evolved into a blueprint for transformation, showing how dedication to animal welfare could heal not just individual horses, but an entire industry. The horses that had once been victims of exploitation had become teachers, showing the way toward a more ethical and compassionate future. As night fell on Sunrise Ranch, the lights in the rehabilitation barns glowed warmly, sheltering horses on their journey from trauma to trust. The legacy of 3 desperate horses in a snowstorm had grown into a movement that would protect and nurture countless others. Their story, a reminder that even the darkest circumstances could lead to profound and lasting change. In the end, the Crystal Creek case didn't just expose and stop abuse. It transformed how humans understood their relationship with horses, replacing exploitation with respect, competition with compassion, and profit with protection. The healing that began on the stormy winter night continued to ripple outward, touching lives and changing hearts, one horse at a time.